Thank you for joining this listening session. Since January, tens of thousands of Minnesotans have flooded my office with calls, letters, and emails, and they're calling out the illegal actions by Elon Musk and Donald Trump to cut funding for our communities and hand out massive tax breaks to billionaires. I've held several town hall meetings, and I've done some of those with our state representatives. And we are focused on how the Republican cuts are damaging our communities when we meet. This is a field hearing. This is the second one, or you can call it a listening session. It's in a series that I'm holding to collect informal and formal testimony to document community impacts of these cuts. On June 18th, our hearing had to be held virtually because it occurred just following the assassination of Speaker Hortman and her husband, Mark, and the attempted murders of Senator Hoffman and his wife, Yvette. And to John and Yvette, we're sending you continued well wishes on a speedy recovery. And to the Huffman family, the session that you did on the current Sharing Your Parents' Music was absolutely fabulous. Thank you for doing that. Well, together we're determined that these heinous acts will not silence us, so we remain resolved in our determination to speak out about these important matters. We plan to hold another hearing session in September to gather more testimony on how cuts are undermining health care in our community. President Trump and congressional Republicans are making cuts, and the disruptions happen so quickly that in so many ways that it's so difficult to track the damage that's being done. Many of the cuts and the actions are also illegal and unconstitutional. Why? Because Article 1 of the Constitution gives me, as a member of Congress, the power of the purse, not the president. His power comes later in Article 2, and his power is only to consult with us on how funding is spent. President Trump and Republicans are creating chaos for Minnesotans through flat funding in a year-long 2025 continuing resolution, and through its unlawful executive orders and what DOJ did. Through H.R. 1, also known as a reconciliation bill, and also called One Big Beautiful Bill. Yes, they actually named the bill that. And then there is H.R. 4, which is a rescission package that was passed. It's vital that we document together the cuts and their consequences for our communities so that we can chart the long and difficult process it will be when we rebuild in the future. We are focusing today on the impacts of the Republicans' passage of H.R. 4, which is a rescission package. This is the first. They're starting to work on a second. This was the first, however, rescission bill to pass in 25 years. So it's something that's done very seldom and done with great input, usually from both sides of the aisle. This passed on a bare Republican majority of a vote of 216 to 213 in the U.S. House, and it passed late at night. On July, that was in July, H.R. 4 officially rescinded or yanked back or cut back funding that a bipartisan Congress had just passed 4 months ago and had been signed into law. The Republicans in Congress followed through with President Trump's demands to pull back $9 billion from public media and the American aid that we send all over the world in our good name. The Trump administration has stated its intention to pursue rescissions, to normalize clawbacks and additional federal funds that have been passed by Congress, funds for infrastructure, education, research, funds for our local governments, our universities, and our nonprofits. H.R. 4 cuts don't stand alone, however. They're part of a much larger extremist right-wing agenda outlined in Project 2025, and that's now being enacted. The Trump administration wants to cancel federal partnerships with our communities while doling out billions of dollars in tax breaks for billionaires and huge giveaways even for fossil fuel companies. Today, we're joined by community members who will provide a firsthand look at the impacts that these decisions have on our communities. And to the partners who are working to try to save lives at home and abroad. Joining me, and you will hear from them shortly, Twin Cities Public Television, Nels Knudsen, Director of Government Relations, Minnesota Public Radio and American Public Media, Mark Evans, Managing Director and of Distribution, the Association of Greater Public Educational Radio Stations, also called AMPERS, Joel Glazer, President and CEO. From the Center for Victims of Torture, Neil Porter, Director of International Services, and a nonviolent for Peace Force, Amy Hansen, Senior Advancement Director. And then, of course, the glue that holds our state together, the Minnesota Center for Nonprofits, Sakari Engstead, Vice President. Public media impacts in the H.R. 4 rescission eliminated $1 billion for all federal funding for public media in that tranche. For 50 years, public broadcasting has earned bipartisan support because Congress has recognized access to nonpartisan community news and information is in the American public's best interest. In an emergency, when your power goes out and the cell networks or the internet goes down, public radio is the most reliable form of communications. It's a backbone. Local public radio stations provide live news during disasters, providing real-time information to listeners on available resources and safe locations. And I'm a major supporter of that policy that requires automakers to keep AM and FM radio in our cars so you can listen to public media. Without federal support, many small stations in rural communities won't survive. Before the House voted on H.R. 4, I led a letter with nearly 50 members of Congress asking the Trump administration to withdraw or to answer to Congress how they plan to make up for the emergency alert and public information services that will be lost. I'm still waiting for a response, and I'll be asking again. The impact on U.S. assistance to the world. Well, H.R. 4 also revokes $8 billion in aid that Congress passed on a bipartisan basis and was signed into law for life-saving assistance around the world, including food assistance for families, core nutrition services for children under 5. For context, $8 billion, that's roughly 1/10 of 1%, 1/10 of 1% of the U.S. budget. That's what goes into this federal aid. The return on our investment, though, however, is massive in the form of peace, stability. It saves lives and it improves quality of life for everyone around the world. And the world sees the United States as a helping partner. Tragically, it's been revealed that the Trump administration incinerated, yes, destroyed nearly 500 tons of emergency food that was already paid for to go to starving children. The food was there and the money was there to distribute it. It had been signed into law, but President Trump chose to burn it. And last week, we learned that the same cruel fate awaits near $10 million of taxpayer-purchased contraceptives intended for women who lack access to for their reproductive health. This senseless destruction of aid for the most vulnerable families around the world is a direct result of President Trump's illegally freezing funds and now working to rescind them. But the Republicans are helping in that collaboration. That is, in my opinion, a waste of taxpayer-purchased food or medicine. And, you know, if we don't have meetings like this, people won't hear about it. In my opinion, that's the real fraud, that's the real waste, and the real abuse that's taking place. Congress needs to be investigating and stopping these harmful actions. Think to yourself, how many lives could have been saved if the United States had just kept its commitments, President Trump? Not only will this bill have devastated the impacts of the lives of millions of children and families around the world, the cuts in this bill will actively make our country less safe. The cuts in the Republicans' H.R. 4 will make it harder to monitor health threats that originate abroad. Things like drug-resistant TB, Mpox, Ebola. It will hurt our ability to counter our adversaries' global influence and damage America's credibility around the world. These cuts are just the latest retreat from a long-held, bipartisan American values at home and abroad. And what this will do is will create a vacuum of leadership that China is only too happy to fill. As Trump's first-term Secretary of Defense, who I got the honor and privilege of knowing, retired General James Mattis, said to us, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition." That's the end of his quote, but he went on to say, fund the State Department so we don't put our children in harm's way at war. Today, we won't be able to tell the whole story about how the Trump's tax cuts are affecting Minnesotans today, but know that I'm committed to making sure that these stories can be told, and I am putting them officially in the congressional record. I'll continue to use every tool I have to oppose these disastrous policies and any effort by President Trump and congressional Republicans to take away food, health care, and basic services that Minnesotans rely on. Now, this is a listening session. This is one of these tools. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first testifier. Mr. Knudsen of Twin Cities Public Television, or as we call it here at home, TPT, is with us today. TPT has a long proven trusted regional journalism and educational children programming and cultural storytelling here in Minnesota. And we learn about each other through that. It reaches about 80% of Minnesota residents. That's a lot of people. And TPT also plays a critical role in the emergency alert system. But congressional Republicans and President Trump rescinded the $1.1 billion in advance funding for the corporation's public broadcasting. That resulted in a 10% cut to TPT's operating budget. Now, TPT faces some tough choices about operations and programming. So, Mr. Knudsen, you're here to tell us more about it. Please do.
Good morning, Congressman McCollum. My name is Niels Knudsen. I'm the Director of Government Relations at Twin Cities PBS, or TPT. First of all, thank you so much for your longstanding support of public television and public media. And also thank you for the invitation to testify today on behalf of TPT regarding the impact of the $1.1 billion cut of previously appropriated funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. These cuts, they'll be felt by TPT, by our public media colleagues across the country, and most importantly, the Minnesotans who value our work as a trusted source of public affairs information, a local storyteller, a producer of educational content for children, and a community resource for viewers of all ages. TPT began broadcasting as the first non-commercial public television station in Minnesota in 1957. And while our over-the-air signal serves the greater Twin Cities metro area, we reach the entire state by sharing content with our partners in the Minnesota Public Television Association on the Minnesota Channel, which also airs live coverage of the Minnesota legislature, and through programming such as Almanac, the longest-running public affairs program in the state. TPT's reach is national as well. After 5 years of development, in March, we premiered Skillsville, a nationwide series airing on PBS Kids, which teaches youth ages 4 to 8 essential life skills and helps expose kids to future careers. Skillsville has been a great success, having recently surpassed 50 million streams since launch. New episodes premiered on July 28th, and the show has averaged 1 million streams per day since then. Unfortunately, TPT was notified in May by the U.S. Department of Education that our Ready to Learn grant was terminated, effective immediately. This funding would have allowed us to complete 22 episodes that were in production, beyond the 18 that had already been released. While we seek alternative funding sources to complete production of these remaining episodes, we know that federal support is a critical resource for stations to deliver safe, trusted children's programming like Skillsville. And finally, TPT is a critical partner in public safety, health, and emergency preparedness with TPT Now, a 24/7 resource sharing alerts via broadcast, online, and social media in 4 languages. This year alone, TPT Now provided 76 warnings in urban and rural areas, protecting Minnesotans through floods, tornadoes, and an Amber Alert. When public health and safety are at risk, TPT Now ensures Minnesotans are ready. For decades, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has supported local public media stations, large and small, to serve their communities just as we do at TPT, with local stories, educational programming, and public safety resources, all for free and without commercial interference. Congress rescinding CPB's funding for FY26 and 27 and the subsequent announcement by CPB that it'll cease operations by the end of the year threatens the essential programming and resources our community counts on. Funding from CPB is nearly 10% of TPT's annual revenue. As a result of this funding loss, TPT made the extremely difficult decision to reduce its overall workforce, resulting in layoffs of staff throughout the organization. In addition, CPB provided many services to public television stations with costs that will be shouldered by local stations going forward, including managing music rights and interconnection, which facilitates content distribution between stations in all 50 states and U.S. territories. TPT will also feel reverberations from the difficult decisions that other public television stations are making across the country in response to these federal funding cuts. For example, Fans of American Experience, a documentary series distributed on public television nationwide that profiles significant people and events in American history, were disappointed to learn that the public television station which produces this series was forced to lay off 13 employees who work on the program and pause production of new episodes as a result of these cuts. Losses such as these will be felt throughout the system as each station adjusts to strained financial circumstances. As we process the devastating loss of our deeply valued colleagues and programming as a result of the CPB funding cut, I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank the legions of TPT members, donors, and viewers, and members of Congress like yourself who stood up for public media when our federal funding came under threat. For more than 20 years, Americans have said that they trust PBS more than any other national institution. And we're proud that 86% of viewers say they trust TPT for unbiased, well-researched local content. With that vote of confidence from the viewing public, we forge ahead. We look forward to our continued partnership with public television stations across the country and specifically here at home through the Minnesota Public Television Association. We remain committed to our mission and to delivering balanced public affairs coverage, enriching children's programs, lifelong learning resources, and Minnesota-made stories for generations to come. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Evans from Minnesota Public Radio, NPR. And in full disclosure, when I'm in Washington, D.C. working, I listen to WETA. And it gets confusing. I have ETA on in my bedroom, and I have NPR in my ear when I walk out the door to go to work. So I have had to think more than once what the temperature really is outside. NPR is a leading voice in regional and national journalism. It's also confronting significant challenges in the aftermath of the federal government's decision to rescind funding for Corporation for Public Broadcasting. As part of the American Public Media Group, NPR operates one of the largest and most respected public radio networks in the country. With 45 stations, NPR serves nearly all of Minnesota and parts of surrounding states, reaching over 1 million listeners every week. That's 1 million listeners, I would think, every hour that you're on. NPR's programming is designed to build bridges and understanding, not create division. For every $1 the Corporation for Public Broadcasting grants for public media generates more than 6 times that amount of private contributions. That's a good deal. NPR is more than effective with its private and public funding ratio of 8-to-1. The loss of CBC funding has triggered staffing reductions and raised concerns about the long-term stability of NPR's programming and services. So today we have Mr. Evans to tell us more.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Evans, and I'm the Managing Director of Distribution for Minnesota Public Radio, NPR, and American Public Media, APM. Thank you, Congresswoman McCollum, for hosting the listening session today. Thank you for your steadfast support of public media. Thank you for listening to both NPR and WETA when you get the chance. We appreciate it. And thank you for all those who are listening and watching. Today, I'd like to share information about Minnesota Public Radio and the impact of the rescissions from a local and regional perspective. And I'll also speak about what this means from a national perspective as it relates to our distribution division and its delivery of programming to stations across the country and the broader public media system. Minnesota Public Radio, NPR, is an independently owned, FCC-licensed, nonprofit organization dedicated to providing community news, information, local music and culture, educational content, and public safety services through various emergency alerts. As mentioned, our 45-station statewide and regional network reaches nearly 1 million listeners each week, and as we make independent local journalism and music freely available to all Minnesotans and those in the region. Our 3 regional services, NPR News, Your Classical NPR, and The Current, provide 24/7 programming both on air and online that strengthen our local communities by connecting people to something larger than themselves. We help Minnesota navigate and connect its people, its stories, its challenges, and its joys. Just yesterday, also as mentioned by the Congresswoman, our music station, The Current, connected Minnesotans with Sophie and Colin Hortman, the children of Melissa and Mark Hortman, as they shared some of their parents' favorite songs. It's a powerful example of how music can connect us. And if you haven't heard it or had the opportunity to listen, I highly recommend it. You can find that at thecurrent.org. NPR also serves as the backbone of the emergency alert system and the Amber Alerts here in Minnesota, and plays a critical role in keeping people informed and safe during emergencies. We have seen recent floods, storm alerts, and fires that show us just how important this service is. Over the past 8 months, our organization has seen the most serious funding threats on multiple fronts, both locally and nationally, more so than in our 58-year history. From FCC investigations, executive orders of state funding cuts, and most notably the Rescission Act of 2025, which again, as mentioned, clawed back $1.1 billion in CPB funding. Over the years, federal grants from CPB have been an essential investment in our community and providing NPR the resource to partner with and engage with local communities, listeners, businesses, and foundations. The public media system represents a public-private partnership at its best. For every $1 of CPB grant, the public media generates more than six times that amount in private contributions. NPR as an organization is even more effective than that, with a public-private ratio of 8-to-1. Beyond federal support, we are primarily listener-supported, with 74% of our revenue coming from the public, including listeners, members, sponsors, businesses, and foundations. Our listeners and members stepped up to meet this moment, and we have been incredibly grateful for their support and advocacy. That support, however, cannot fill the hole left by federal funding cuts. Between the CPB cuts, approximately $5.1 million to our budget, and reduced funding from Minnesota, the legislature this year, NPR is facing a hole of more than $6 million. That means that we are reviewing our operations, our cost structure, and how we balance our strategic priorities and investments to find savings in the face of these cuts. Our leadership has recently informed the organization and the employees of a reduction in staff of approximately 5 to 8%. That will happen this month, meaning many of my colleagues, the community, and our neighbors will face traumatic and devastating job loss. With an eye towards the future, support could not be more critical. The second perspective I'd like to share with you today is the national perspective. Public media is the country's only local, no-cost, commercial-free, nonprofit news and informational service. With 1,300 public radio stations across the country, public media provides more than 95% of the country with news, storytelling, music, emergency systems, educational offerings, and public affairs coverage. On a national level, as noted, public media costs $1.60 per American per year in federal funding, less than the cost of a cup of coffee. Yet it delivers a wealth of resource and fosters informed public discourse, contributing to a stronger and more connected community. As shared, NPR's business, part of NPR's business is American Public Media, which creates and distributes award-winning nationally syndicated radio programming and content. We license this program to approximately 900 stations across the country. You may recognize some of these programs, such as Marketplace, the BBC World Service, The Splendid Table, The Daily, On Point, This Old House, and This Old House Radio Hour, as well as Classical 24. We're the sole distributor of the BBC across the United States and the largest producer of classical music programming in the country. As the second largest distributor of national programming for public media, we know that stations face hard choices as they grapple with their CPB defunding in their markets, while making decisions about whether they can or cannot continue to acquire nationally syndicated programming, which is so important to their communities, which will ultimately impact the service to their communities and the programs that we produce as well. While this is uncharted territory for us at the moment, we are committed as an organization to continue to serve the audiences that have come to rely and trust on the information and services and the content that we provide. So what happens now? Our assessment is that the recent rescission and the recent rescission of the federal funding will severely impact both public media here at home and the public media wider network as we know it. It will be especially devastating to public media stations serving hundreds of rural, tribal, and underserved communities across the country. Going back to the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, the design of public media was to provide federal support for a system that covered places and parts of the country that commercial simply does not cover because it is not financially viable. As shared in our work, we see this at a national level as we work with stations across the country that are licensing our content, and they will be scaling back and facing cuts. We are hearing that now. The harsh reality is many of those stations simply will not make it. A significant number of stations receive 30% or more of their funding from the CPB, and approximately 30 stations receive 40% or more of their funding from the CPB. And with that going away starting October 1st, it's a big hole to dig out of in a very short time. NPR and APM are committed to finding a path forward to delivering the news, the information, the music, arts, and cultural programming, as well as emergency alerts that our listeners and supporters trust and rely on. In a polarized media environment rife with disinformation, the role that public media plays in delivering accurate news and information from trusted sources is more important than ever. We remain fierce defenders of the notion that a vigorous and independent press is critical to ensure a functioning and free society. NPR and APM will survive, but we are going to have to make some very difficult decisions. We may have been defunded by the federal government, but we are not defeated. With that, I will say thank you again for the opportunity to speak on behalf of NPR, APM, relative to the recent rescissions and the changes that public media is facing. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. And that was a nice lead-in that you did about how the span of who you reach and who you cover. Talk about Ampers for a minute. And it's something that unless you really get into how things are funded in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, you probably haven't heard of them, but they're a backbone in many, many communities, and many here in Minnesota. It's the Association of Minnesota Public Educational Radio Station, and it's the largest in the state association of independent community radio stations. They support 17 communities throughout Minnesota. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. Northern Community Radio in Brainerd. I've listened to that when I've been vacationing. Boys Fort Tribal Community. I know that the information that you provide is very important, having that there. I've also spoken with the White Earth Nation. They have their own, as well as Cass Lake and Leech Lake. And then there's the North Shore Community Radio in Grand Marais. And then there's right here in the Twin Cities, KFAI, Fresh Air Community Radio. Ampere stations emphasize community engagement because they're at the heart of their community. They often are broadcasting content that is underrepresented in mainstream media, including Native American, immigrant, and minority voices. This network plays a vital role in preserving local music, stories, issues, helping to keep Minnesota's cultural heritage, vast cultural heritage, alive and accessible to everyone. Unlike larger national networks, Amper's stations are locally owned and they're operated, which allows them to stay closely connected to their specific communities. For some of these stations, as was pointed out, the federal funding accounts up to 50% of their operation budgets. Smaller stations in rural communities, as was pointed out, could be utterly devastated by these cuts. And as we have seen, even with in Minneapolis and St. Paul, our news coverage with paper news, with the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press, start to shrink and fold. I know what's happening in the surrounding areas here in Washington and Ramsey County with local papers disappearing. Just imagine how important these radio stations are to these very rural communities. So we have Amper's president, Mr. Glazer, here to tell us more about this very interesting and intriguing part of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting.
Thank you, Congresswoman, excuse me, McCollum. As you mentioned, I am Joel Glazer, President and CEO of Ampers. And as you mentioned, we do represent and support 17 independent community radio stations throughout the state of Minnesota. All of those are stations that are operated and programmed by and for their local communities. Our stations primarily are serving underserved communities, and we define underserved as Black, Indigenous, people of color, new immigrants, those living in greater Minnesota, and those living with a disability. 13 of our 17 stations are in greater Minnesota. 4 of them are licensed to Native tribes. 6 are licensed to a college, school, or university. 8 are licensed directly to the community that they serve, and that includes KKWE in White Earth, which you mentioned, which is licensed directly to the White Earth Land Recovery Project rather than the tribe itself, so it is standing on its own. 10 of our stations, of the 17 stations, were receiving CPB funding. As you mentioned, our stations are hyper-local. There's a lot of confusion, so I need to mention that we are not affiliated, nor do we receive funding from NPR or TPT. We are an association rather than a network. And what that means is when you are listening to WTIP up in Grand Marais, and you're listening to KQAL in Winona, that you are going to hear very different programming because they are programmed for their specific local communities. We don't have big development teams. We don't have multi-million-dollar budgets, but our stations play a very, very important role in their local communities, and we rely very heavily on volunteers because they are very, very small staffs. Because these stations are so different, how the cuts will impact them varies tremendously. For some stations, the CPB grants were as little as 15%, but for some, it is as high as 50%. The stations that we are most concerned about are KKWE in White Earth and KSRQ in Thief River Falls, which is licensed to Northland Community and Technical College. We're trying to be very transparent and realistic. We do not want to be accused of exaggerating. That said, with KKWE losing 50% of their funding, if they cannot replace it, they are estimating they will not be on the air come March of next year. KSRQ in Thief River Falls, our next biggest concern, they believe they can stay on the air for about roughly a year. 40% of their budget was CPB. In both KSRQ and KKWE's case, there is another mitigating factor. Losing that federal funding could impact their state funding as well, because there is a tie to the requirements of the number of full-time equivalents or FTEs. The stations get about $180,000 in state funding. They are required to keep those full-time equivalents. With the cuts, many of them could fall below the FTEs, and as a result, lose their state funding as well. Basically, their funding loss doubles. These cuts are hitting the native stations and our other stations in greater Minnesota the hardest. KBFT, a tribally run station in Bois Forte, is losing about 45% of their revenue. KOJB in Leech Lake is losing about 35% of its revenue. As you mentioned, those cuts create a public safety concern as well. There's a lot of talk about emergency alerts. The fact of the matter is, we're less concerned about emergency alerts themselves. They will continue to go out. They will, those who support the cuts are saying they will go out through commercial and wireless alerts on the phone. That is correct. But what they're forgetting is incredibly important. Those emergency announcements are very short. And what they say is, tune to your local radio and TV stations for more information. Most commercial radio stations in greater Minnesota are owned by large corporations with no local on-air staff. The commercial TV stations are in big cities and not providing detailed emergency information. Our small local community radio stations are the ones breaking into regular programming and putting emergency officials on the air for extended periods of time to talk about evacuation routes, forest fires, 911 outages, and other real emergencies that happen every year. These are not hypothetical situations. These are things that happen right here in Minnesota. Supporters of the cut say that those living in greater Minnesota can get the information online. A recent storm blew through in north central Minnesota just a few weeks ago and took the internet down. Earlier this summer, power was out for 2 days. People couldn't get internet or the TV. Those with battery operated radio got critical information from KAXE in Grand Rapids. The loss of federal funding is a very significant concern and could mean the demise of some of our stations. If that happens, that could leave some communities in greater Minnesota without life-saving information. Congresswoman, I'm going to surprise you with my final comment, which is that I don't blame some elected officials for defunding some of the public media, because some taxpayer dollars were being used for political purposes and to advocate for one side of political issues. Our philosophy is that if you accept even a dime of public funding, you should be amplifying all voices and perspectives shy of those advocating violence. The problem is there were many public radio stations around the country that didn't share that perspective, and as a result, we became collateral damage. Thank you again for your continued support and for giving us the opportunity to speak.
I appreciate your comment about maybe some radio stations weren't following the guidelines that were set up by Congress. But there's a way to address that. Congress can have a hearing. You can send a letter. A member of Congress can do something about it. You can take corrective action. But that was not the path that they chose. And so now everyone is in harm's way. Thank you for sharing that. So now we're going to talk about some of the fabulous work that our nonprofits do. And I mentioned earlier in my statement about how food has been incinerated, you know, and I'm going to say life-saving. As a member of Congress, I've been in hospitals in Tanzania. I've been in, and you know, what we call a hospital, someone would probably hear defined as a crude clinic. We're having birth control for a mom who's just had her 4th pregnancy, maybe enrolled, not spaced the way that's healthy for her. Now it's not going to have access to life-saving birth control, so that family continues to have a mother. So there's also other things that we do with our tax dollars that I've seen in work. And I've seen the Centers for Victims of Torture operate internationally and here at home. Founded in 1985 here in St. Paul, the Center for Victims of Torture was the first US-based organization dedicated to the rehabilitation of torture survivors. It has since grown into a global leader in trauma-informed care. CVT, as it's called, operates healing centers in 6 countries and partners with organizations and many more. A few years ago, I even volunteered on renovations for the Healing Center here in St. Paul, right up on Dayton Avenue. And I hope my paint job was pretty good and it's still holding up. In 2024 alone, CTV worked to rebuild the lives and hopes of more than 24,000 survivors and their family members. These clients reported having been tortured in 63 different countries of origin, sought refuge here in the United States, and were granted it here legally. But in January 2025, the U.S. government suspended or terminated most of CVT's foreign aid funding, including grants from the U.S. Department of State and USAID. Mr. Porter's here to update us on how the center's critical work has been affected. Mr. Porter.
Thank you, Representative McCollum, and thanks to your staff for organizing this listening session and for asking CVT to participate and contribute here at the state capitol. Most here in this room are probably unaware that 40 years ago, and through the good offices of then Governor Perpich, that the idea, then the reality of CVT was born. When Governor Perpich decided that Minnesota should and could make a unique contribution to human rights globally by establishing the United States' first center to treat the complex needs of survivors of torture and trauma. My name is Neil Porter. I work at CVT as the Director of International Services. That means that I have responsibility for overseeing our torture and trauma rehabilitation work outside of the United States. It's been my pleasure and privilege to work at CVT for more than 20 years. I work here in St. Paul. CVT provides interdisciplinary rehabilitation, and by that I mean psychotherapy, physical therapy, social work support, and psychiatry to individuals who have experienced usually multiple traumatic events, including torture, sexual torture, at the hands of authorities, and often in the context of large-scale humanitarian displacement and violence. As Representative McCollum said, our clients here in the Twin Cities come from more than 60 countries. And our service delivery footprint has expanded outside of Minnesota to a treatment center in Atlanta, Georgia, and to a migrant shelter in Tucson, Arizona. Outside of the United States, we have rehabilitation programs in Uganda, 2 locations in Kenya, multiple locations in Ethiopia, and increasingly, after our clients achieve a certain level of healing, our work has evolved to include helping our clients achieve a certain level of justice. We also maintain a small office in Washington, D.C. to engage allies on Capitol Hill and other human rights organizations in the areas of mutual interest, including increasing resources for the torture treatment movement here in the United States and globally. So what started here 40 years ago at the impetus of Governor Perpich grew to become not only this country's first torture treatment center, but the world's largest torture treatment center with the most extensive reach, the greatest impact, up until January of this year. Beginning in January of this year, CVT lost 75% of its funding and therefore 75% of its staff. We've laid off more than 400 people globally, including 25 here in Minnesota. Our budget at the start of last fiscal year was estimated to be around 38 million. This coming fiscal year, it'll be 11 million. Despite those cuts, CVT remains the largest torture treatment center in the United States and remains the leader of the torture treatment movement around the world. As devastating as the cuts have been to CVT, they are even more devastating to our clients, many of whom have unequivocally told us that they would have ended their lives had it not been for CVT. Let me start with an analogy. Imagine you are undergoing surgery in an operating room. In order for you to fully heal, first, the highly skilled surgeon needs to thoroughly and methodically open, examine, repair, clean, then close the injury. Now imagine, mid-surgery and without explanation, the surgeon and her team are ordered to leave the operating room, unable to return, leaving you stranded, alone, exposed, and unhealed. Your wound remains open. In the psychological sense, that exact scenario is what this administration has forced CVT to do in our overseas operations. Starting on Friday, January 24th of this year, and through a series of poorly written, highly ideological, and unspecific emails from officials with questionable legal authority, CVT was ordered to cease all operations. Because of this, we in effect were forced to abandon our clients, many of whom were in the midst of processing their most horrific experiences of torture. This was not only distressing for our clients, it was also morally injurious to our staff, who were forced to work in a way that violated their personal and professional ethics. Hundreds of psychological and in many cases physical wounds remain open and unhealed to this day. Since the start of the stop work orders, 4 of CVT's federally funded grants have subsequently been terminated, along with a subaward through another agency, totaling more than $13 million in cuts annually. The fate of our remaining U.S. government awards remains in a state of ambiguity, preventing both full project implementation, but also preventing moving toward project closure. This ongoing limbo is the exact opposite of government efficiency. All of the projects I just referenced were funded in fiscal year 2023, so the recent rescissions do not impact CVT directly in the short term, with one likely exception that I'll describe shortly. But the rescissions are part of a larger pattern that has played out since January. Order the stoppage of work, cancel contracts, fire U.S. government employees, and dismantle entire congressionally mandated agencies under dubious legal authority. Falsely claim that the process for contractual review has taken place. Ignore or slow walk implementation of court orders, then finally attempt to justify actions well after the damage has been done by requesting Congress approve funding cuts. Ultimately, all of this ultimately leaving U.S. foreign assistance, U.S. reputation, and congressional spending authority itself in tatters. The likely exception I referenced a few moments ago that could have further negative impact on CBT is cuts to what's called the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture. The UN VFT supports organizations on a smaller scale, including CBT, that provide rehabilitation services for torture survivors and work to prevent and seek accountability for torture. The US historically has been the largest contributor to this fund, $9 million annually. It appears that the rescissions package eliminated that contribution entirely for fiscal year 2025. If that is the case, that loss of support will harm torture survivors around the world, including here in Minnesota. CBT believes this administration's actions actually undermine its America First aims, that our retreat from daily and global assistance and development support in nearly all of its forms will in the long run make the US less understood, less safe, less strong, and less prosperous. Because of this, and because of the reckless and we believe illegal the way the administration shut down several of our programs, on May 2nd, CBT joined a lawsuit with 2 other organizations that seek relief from the administration's suspension and termination of the vast majority of foreign assistance awards. Standing up, speaking out, and fighting back is the least that we can do on behalf of our clients, the bravest people we know. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's been powerful testimony that we heard from our folks from Corporation of Public Broadcasting, but this is very personal, what is happening to these individuals. And I've been in refugee camps, and I've been with women who have been victims of extreme violence. I wouldn't want to put it on my website and have children stumble upon it doing a research project. Thank you for your work. There's another group that's been doing a lot of great work, and maybe you haven't heard of them. They're not quite as large a profile as the Center for Victims of Torture. It's the Nonviolent Peace Force. It was founded in 2002. It's an international peace organization, and they work to prevent what we just heard, torture. They work to protect civilians in conflict zones by deploying civilian peacekeepers. And as I said, many of you maybe haven't heard of them, but this organization is recognized all over the world for its excellent work. In fact, it was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2016. The Nonviolent Peace Force sends trained, unarmed peacekeepers to conflict areas to act as deterrents to attacks on civilian populations, to monitor human rights abuse, to facilitate dialogue, and to assist people with safe access to essential services. They've assisted civilian populations threatened by war in Myanmar, South Sudan, Iraq, and Ukraine, all countries I've been to. They work closely with local communities and their organizations. This organization, as I said, is recognized all over the world. Ms. Hansen, thank you for being here today and to share how these cuts are impacting your work people deserve to know about.
Thank you, Representative McCollum, for having me to learn about the impact these cuts are having on people in conflict areas around the globe. At Nonviolent Peace Force, otherwise known as NP, we work with communities in conflict zones to keep civilians safe through unarmed methods. Our teams live and work alongside people facing grave danger, using tools like accompaniment, relationship building, and early warning systems to interrupt cycles of violence and to build lasting peace. I've also traveled to 2 of these countries with my work, South Sudan and Myanmar. Nonviolent Peace Force has been around for 22 years, and we've trained over 26,000 people in our methods, impacting the lives of millions. We know that conflict is inevitable, but we know that violence is not. I'm going to start with an example of our work from South Sudan. Women in the Bentiu internally displaced person camp were routinely being sexually assaulted when leaving to gather firewood, something they needed to cook for their families. It's not in the UN mandate to accompany people outside of the camp. They faced an impossible choice: risk assault or have their children go without eating. Nonviolent Peace Force met with women's protection teams who we trained and are volunteers from the community. Together, they developed a plan. The women would travel in groups accompanied by our protection officers, some who were international. They mapped safer routes, built relationships with locals along the way to monitor threats, and stayed updated on security reports from groups like the UN. Over time, the walk has grown longer as the area has become deforested. But MP has accompanied the women over 1,000 times without any further assault. These women protection teams are also leaders for peace in their communities. They educate others and advocate against gender-based violence, including domestic abuse, sexual assault, and early childhood marriage. They play a vital role in resolving local conflicts. In one community, the traditional tribunal council composed of men told people, if you want to pay a fine, come to us. If you actually want to resolve your problem, go to the women's protection team. These women don't just raise awareness of human rights and shift community attitudes, they take direct action to prevent harm. Some have spoken with fathers to help girls return to school instead of being forced into marriage. Others have intervened when they heard rumors of young boys planning to join armed groups, persuading them to stay and to complete their education instead. Before I speak about our work on Myanmar, I would like to respectfully request that these remarks be off the record due to the extreme risks facing our team on the ground. Yeah.
Because we could do that, so
Okay.
if you want it off the record, then we will not rebroadcast these remarks, Luke. Is that what you mean by
Yeah,
that?
just for Myanmar. That's okay.
So I just wanted to make sure you can it's. So I'm going to ask you to share them with afterwards, other than that he has to stop the live stream. Okay?
All right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for saying that ahead of time, too. And I honor that you're respecting what has happened to these women because I've been in circles with them. Thank you. Please go on with the rest of your
Okay.
testimony.
All right. So our program in South Sudan has already been under strain with when USAID funding disappeared. Now this is funding that was pulled back already in 2024, as it was not considered immediately life-saving, but peace-building work. Even though there is a resurgence of civil war possible. And our funders like Switzerland and the Netherlands have followed the US lead by slashing their own support. What was once a robust multi-government effort to protect civilians has rapidly unraveled. In Ukraine, local groups we partner with, fishing associations, women's networks, they put their own lives at risk to evacuate their families from frontline areas. They use their own vehicles, their own fuel. They were already underfunded, and now they have nothing. The UN Humanitarian Pooled Fund for Ukraine has received 4 times more requests this cycle than the last, a sign of rising desperation. And they've asked Nonviolent Peace Force for more resources, which we aren't able to provide. These cuts don't just affect funding, they destroy trust. Organizations like ours build relationships slowly and with care. Communities come to rely on us. When programs vanish overnight, these relationships are broken and they may never recover. The message to the communities is that the US cannot be counted on. Violent actors are watching And as the US pulls away from humanitarian law and human rights, others follow. Armed groups seize that opportunity to escalate. Our staff see this happening. They're on the ground, living among the people, and they are warning us. This is not about bloated foreign aid budgets. The work we've done with USAID has never been about dependency. It's about helping communities take care of each other safely and without violence. These cuts are a deliberate dismantling of the systems that keep people alive. They make the world less safe. They make us less safe. I'll share my remarks from Myanmar after then.
Thank you. And we do need to know about that, but we also need to be respectful of who might be listening. I know NPR and TPT are great about that. I'm sure the local radio stations are too when they're doing things. So if people need to step aside, that they can. But you need to take care of yourself too, once you've heard the stories. So last but not least, because I said this is I think that our nonprofits are the glue that hold Minnesota together. So we've been listening to the impacts of federal budgets being revoked at so many different angles, but most of these speakers have in common is they're all nonprofits. Here in Minnesota, we are lucky to have such a vibrant nonprofit sector. And Minnesota, our nonprofits are looked at to nonprofits all around the United States and emerging democracies on how to set up an effective system that works for community. I've had the pleasure of having a closing working relationship with Minnesota's Council of Nonprofits as a user, as a Girl Scout leader, and as a member of Congress. One of the largest state associations of nonprofits in the country is, as I pointed out, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. And they look at interests all across the state and work with communities all across our state. So I'm pleased to welcome back Ms. Amstead, who has, I should give you your full title, Madam Vice President Amstead, for giving me such fantastic information and tools to use in my toolbox when I go on the House floor to fight back on these cuts. But you gave us a little bit of information in our June listening session. I know we'll be including you again in the September one. So just kind of share with us what you're hearing from your member organizations about the impacts of these precision cuts, because they are widespread and we only touched on a few of them. Please.
Greetings. Hello, my name is Kari Yanased. I serve as Vice President of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. MCN is so proud to represent more than 2,100 nonprofit organizations across the state, working in every corner of Minnesota to advocate along nonprofits and strengthen communities for nearly 40 years. Thank you again, Congresswoman McCollum, for your steadfast support of Minnesota nonprofits and for inviting these incredible organizations to share the stories of impact today. Let's be clear, bills like HR 1 and HR 4 are a direct threat to the well-being of Minnesotans. These bills do not trim excess, they gut essential services and force already stretched nonprofits to absorb the impact of federal abandonment. This is an expectation that's both unrealistic and dangerous. These bills shift demand for critical services onto nonprofits while simultaneously driving up our costs and slashing the funding we rely on. This is not just a budgetary maneuver, it's a decision to undermine the public safety net, destabilize local economies, and leave our communities behind. Nonprofits do extraordinary work. We step in when crises arise, but we cannot replace the scale, reach, or reliability of government safety net programs or funding. No matter how generous institutional philanthropy is, it only covers a fraction, about 10% of what federal government funding provides. So not only do bills like HR 1 and HR 4 create gaps that nonprofits or private philanthropy can't fill, these cuts also shift burden to the state and local governments, and by extension, nonprofit organizations, especially as you've heard today, in rural areas where services are already stretched thin. In Minnesota, this means millions more in costs and fewer tools to meet need. On top of that, nonprofits are already under strain. According to MCN's 2025 Current Conditions Report that was just released last week, in the past year, 70% of Minnesota nonprofits have seen an increase in the demand for services. 82% of Minnesota nonprofits are reporting rising business expenses, and nearly half have seen decline in funding from government and foundations. So our environment for work is already unsustainable, and these bills are going to make it worse. The fallout will include fewer services and more unmet needs, especially in rural and suburban communities that make up 2/3 of Minnesota's nonprofit sector. We'll see layoffs and furloughs that both hurt workers and the communities they serve. Nonprofit professionals make up 13% of Minnesota's workforce. We'll see disruptions to mission critical services as payment delays or cuts are going to force nonprofits to pause or shut down programs, and permanent harm to essential safety net programs, where temporary disruptions today may result in irreversible loss of services tomorrow. For some, as you've heard today, it is a matter of life and death. Again, nonprofits cannot fill the gap left by government disinvestment. We're being asked to hold together a crumbling societal safety net with fewer and fewer resources. These bills will force hard decisions for state policymakers who will have to weigh cutting other vital services or raising new revenue just to preserve what is left. MCN will be joining advocates asking Minnesota policymakers to reject these laws' skewed priorities and instead prioritize meeting Minnesotans' basic needs. This is not a time for us to be silent. Nonprofits must speak out. While these are federal laws, Minnesota's legislators, the governor and lieutenant governor, need to hear on-the-ground impacts of how proposals to cut funding and services will impact the people and communities that nonprofit organizations serve. Nonprofits, we have the stories, we have the data, we have the expertise, and the moral clarity to show why a strong public safety net matters. Together, we can remind lawmakers that what is truly big and beautiful policy is actually about creating thriving communities for everyday people who contribute so much toward a shared goal of a prosperous Minnesota. Let's remind our lawmakers, strong communities are built by investing in people, not by cutting them loose. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to sum this up, and this is a hearing for me as a listening session. You've given me a lot of food for thought on some of the ways in which I can reach out to you for more information, to battle back when people say this is fraud, waste, and abuse, that this is really cutting the heart and soul at times and putting people at risk in more than one way that we've heard today. I want to, I mentioned I've done some town halls. I've done town halls with our state representatives. And my message to them is, and this is before the rescission package, look out, it's coming your way. I think in September, when we do our next listening, our next field listening session, we're going to find out just how impacted the federal government is going to be on the dollars received for healthcare, for SNAP, for basic services here. At the same time, we've heard from you, especially the local stations, becoming the state for a match. So they're going to have a lot that they're going to have to weigh in on. And it's going to make your time up here during this next legislative session, I'm a former Minnesota representative and it's supposed to be the short one, very, very difficult. The things that you all mentioned up here and who you all represent are things that I personally can say. I have worked in the past with Republicans to fund these programs. It has been hand in hand. Yes, there are some people who don't like everything. I'm not saying it's total unity, but working with the Centers with Victims of Torture with Chris Smith from New Jersey, and working when public broadcasting was under attack when I was chair of the Interior Committee, working with Republicans to do what we can. And I know there's many Republicans that I've served with that are very concerned about what's happening and trying to figure out how to right the ship. But as you pointed out in your testimony, some people are going to feel these impacts in October and have no time to adapt because this is a cutoff from legal funding that they had planned on in their budgets to use. Some people can survive a little longer, but other people are going to be immediately impacted. So I want to thank you for sharing your testimony. For those of you who are listening today or tomorrow or hearing snippets of this on our social media platform, please, if you have any questions about what you are hearing today, feel free, as you always do. As I said, I've heard from tens of thousands, and I know I'm going to be hearing from more. Call, email, and our office here in either St. Paul or Minnesota will get back to you. You can find it. It's the official office. If you put in the congressional office of Congresswoman McCollum, and I'm sure my crack staff is going to have links and everything else also on here so you can do it. If you don't receive my e-news weekly e-newsletter, I run into people all the time and say, how come I don't get it? I have to say, because you have to sign up for it. As a state legislator, I voted to make Minnesota an opt-in state. So please opt in if you'd like some more information. We're going to honor that commitment that I have always supported. So thank you again for all of you for the difference that you make, whether it's around the world or in somebody's local community, or for someone who don't even know that they've been touched by the work that you do. Thank you for being here. With that, we conclude our listening session.